Thank you for coming this evening. Please turn to the book of Habakkuk as we continue our studies. We are in chapter 2 this evening. Beginning in verse 5. But let's review just a little bit before we do. Remember that the prophecies of Habakkuk occurred, we believe, in the period of Judah alone, after the northern nation had fallen, and the warning was being given to the nation of Judah to fall, that they were going to fall as well. But Habakkuk has some problems, some concerns, because he sees the wickedness, and at first, what is his first complaint, or his concern at first? He sees the wickedness in the land. What is he at first concerned about? Susie?
That God hasn't punished Judah for their sins.
Okay, so he asked God why he hasn't, why he allowed the wickedness, and God responded that he was going to send the Chaldeans. And what concern did that raise? When God said he was going to send the Chaldeans to punish the people of Judah, how did that cause concern for Habakkuk? Neil?
He wondered why he would use a nation more wicked than what Judah was to punish them.
Okay, so why punish them with a nation that was more wicked than they were? So he witnessed the violence and the trouble and so on. Justice wasn't being done, and I asked how long that would continue. And when God said that he was going to send the Chaldeans, then there's a discussion of how evil and wicked the Chaldeans were, which led then for Habakkuk to think that God would not use a wicked nation like the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, to punish a nation. Even though Judah was wicked, they were not as bad as the Chaldeans. And so he uses a comparison that the Chaldeans were like a fisherman who just catching as many fish as they could and didn't care about the fish. How would they be allowed to continue to do even that kind of punishment upon Judah? And so God answers him in verse, basically, beginning in verse 4, which we said at the end of our study last time, that even though one who is proud, which would include specifically the Chaldeans, their soul is not upright, but their soul would, or the just rather, would live by faith. And so we tried to understand or emphasize that this is really a lesson about faith. That those who believe in God and trust in God will recognize that he's going to do what's right. And if he uses the Chaldeans, he has a purpose for it. And we'll emphasize that more as we go along through the rest of the chapter. But rather than criticizing God or exalting our wisdom above his as though we have a better idea than him, we should have confidence that he will do the right thing in dealing with sin. Okay? That's where we were at the end of class the last time. Questions or discussion before we begin with verse 5 tonight? All right, let's go ahead and do some more reading. Let's see what I've got here. Okay. Let's go ahead and read verse 5 through. What we're going to see is some woes that he states against the Babylonians. He knows the sins of the Babylonians. He's going to describe some reasons why the Babylonians are going to be punished as well. So let's look at at the reading first of all. Let's start with verse 5. Let's read let's start with 5. We'll go 5 through 11. Who'd like to read verses 5 through 11 for us, please? Chapter 2, verse 5 through 11. Bill, please, verses 5 through 11.
Indeed, because he transgresses by lying, he is a proud man, and he does not stay at home, because he enlarges his desire as hell, and he is like death and cannot be satisfied. He gathers to himself all nations, and heaps up for himself all peoples. Will not all these take up a proverb against him, and a taunting riddle against him, and say, Woe to him who increases! What is not his, how long? And to him who loads himself with many pleasures, will creditors rise up suddenly? Will they not awaken who oppress you, and you will become their booty? because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you, because of men's blood and the violence of the land and the city, and all who dwell in it. To him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disaster. You give shameful counsel to your house, cutting off many peoples, and sin against your soul. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timbers will answer it.
Okay, so we see the beginning of these woes as he pronounces woe to the nation, and it will continue through the end of the chapter. We'll see several different ones. So he begins at verse 5 before he actually gets to the first one. He describes the sin of the Babylonians, the Chaldeans. And what does he say about them in verse 5? And we're question number 10 now in the questions. What does he say to describe them? Much of this is symbolic, so we'll try to understand the symbols as we go through these verses. But what does he say about that, about the Chaldeans in verse 5? Frank.
They are transgressing by the use of wine, and they're not staying at home minding their own responsibilities, and they're puffed up and arrogant. Okay,
so he says several things about them, including a lot of things we already read back in chapter 1 about them. He says they transgress by wine. From what I've read, the Babylonians were known for their drinking. You may recall Daniel chapter 5, when they fell, the description there, and Daniel read the handwriting on the wall that the Babylonians, the king was having a banquet, and they were drinking and using the vessels that they captured from the temple in Jerusalem. But the point is, they apparently were known for their drinking. But I think there's more to it than just the physical drunkenness. It seems to be a symbol of their thought processes. They didn't think properly. Like a man who's drunk doesn't think properly. And he mistreats, in this case, other people. As Frank said, he doesn't stay at home. But he's proud, okay? The last part of the verse, he uses a description of hell and death. And what is the illustration? I ask you also in the question, what is the significance of hell and death as the illustration of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians? What's the point of this illustration? Hell and death. Velma.
I don't know if this is correct or not, but what made me think of was there's no end to it.
Okay, it says
death is going to be always with us, and hell there's no end to it.
Okay, it says it cannot be satisfied.
You can't be satisfied.
Right. Okay, so no matter how many people die, death is still going to be there, waiting for more people to die. Okay, and hell, the place of the dead people, accepting them, that's always room for more. Okay, and the same way, well, that's the illustration. How does that illustrate the Babylonians, the Chaldeans? How are they like that they're never satisfied? According to the verse, last part of the verse. Rick.
So through their military might, they transgress by wine, meaning that they like their good times. They like the up times for themselves. But they don't stay at home. They enlarge their desire as hell. They go out. And then later it says he gathers to himself all nations. So they go out to all nations and war against them, killing their adversaries and bringing about death.
Okay, and in the same way then, like death and hell, they're never satisfied. Doesn't matter how many nations they capture, how many people they heap up to themselves, they always want more. Okay? And so they're like death and Hades in that they're never satisfied. Okay? Other comments or discussion on the verse, Susie?
This, and then in preparing for tonight's lesson in chapter 2, one of the comments made me think of wine as just basically intoxication. And people can be intoxicated with power and greed. And that seems to be the Babylonians, that greed was never satisfied. And because they were so powerful, they thought they could have whatever they wanted, and they went about doing it.
Okay, very good. That's what I was trying to say when I made the point that the wine is probably, in my view at least, is symbolic, and symbolic of the fact that they always want more, and they're never satisfied. They're not thinking properly. Okay? Other comments? Okay. So he begins his description. Now he said he's giving his answer to Habakkuk, remember. Habakkuk's asking, why are you using these Babylonians, these Chaldeans, to punish the people of Judah who aren't even as bad as they are? And he's telling them in verse 4, he tells him that he needs to have faith, trust him, and we'll see how that goes through. But now he's going to describe the Chaldeans. He knows the evil of the Chaldeans. So he's going to describe it. Habakkuk's not telling him anything. He's telling Habakkuk how bad the Chaldeans are. So let's look at how bad they are as we begin these descriptions of these woes that he describes beginning in verse 6. Some people will take up a proverb against him and a taunting riddle and pronounce this woe to him. And what is the woe? Beginning now in verse 6, the first woe is what? And we're on question number 12 now. The first woe that he pronounces is what? Or is it pronounced against them? Is what? Verse 6.
I call it unjust gain.
Say it again.
Unjust gain.
Unjust gain? Okay, what were you going to say, Rick?
Woe to him who increases what is not his.
Okay, all right. So he's taking what doesn't belong to him. Okay, it's not his, and that's what the Chaldeans did. They would capture these other nations and take what belonged to those people for themselves. Taking what does not belong to themselves, but they take it. Okay? What was the result? What else is described as it talks about what happened? The last part of the verse, or even into verse 7. It says he loads himself. Frank, go ahead.
That they will eventually tremble with, and because they will be spoiled, brought to destruction.
Okay. So he says at the last part of verse 6, he loads himself with many pledges, which may not seem real obvious, but he ended up having creditors, verse 7, who will rise up against them. And they will be not awakened, who oppress you, and you will become their booty. So in what sense are they in debt? It says they take pledges, they have creditors. In what sense is that true? Who is it that they're in debt to in the illustration? Did you think about that when you studied it? Who are their creditors? Terry.
Well, God is one of them.
Okay, ultimately it's God, isn't it? But it's plural. It's creditors. There's more than one. Certainly the main one would be God. Susie.
Well, are you thinking like those countries who paid taxes? Why not taxes? What's the word? Not anyway. Like Jerusalem did, and Egypt did, and others. They paid for their freedom, so to speak. Is that what you?
Okay, in a way, yes. It doesn't explain it directly, but what I took it to mean was that the Babylonians, in essence, became debtors to all these people they were mistreating. They were taking all of these things from these other nations, which didn't belong to the Babylonians, so in effect, they became debtors. And those who gave them that they took all these things from them, they were in debt to them. They had taken what didn't belong, the Babylonians, what didn't belong to them, so they were in effect indebted to those who were they had captured. And then, he says, the result is those who they oppressed will wake up and you will become their booty. You will become you're going to suffer at their hands in the end. That's what I took it to mean. Other comments on that? Does that make sense? Rick?
Well, I think if you read on down through there, especially in verse 8, because you have plundered many nations, and all the remnant of the people shall plunder you. So that's why I took it. It was the people that they was taking things from.
Okay. And so in that sense, they became in debt to them. They'd taken what belonged to the other people, and they were going to have to pay it back in the end. They were going to become plundered, just like they had themselves plundered other people. Okay, and not only because they stole, but last part of verse 8, what else had they done that would bring them to this state of being punished? They not only stole, what else did they do? Last part of verse 8. Jerry?
The killing and violence that they did to the people.
Okay. All right, so they took this from these other nations by blood and violence, and from those in those cities, and that's why they, in turn, are going to be punished themselves. Okay, so in any case, the first woe, it seems to me, is that they increased what did not belong to them, and they were going to be punished. And in the end, even those who they had mistreated would in the end be victorious over them. Okay, other comments through verse 8. Like I said, it's pretty symbolic at times here, and maybe not really easy, but I think that the point in each of these woes is, I think we can get it even if we don't have a real clear understanding of all the details. Okay? At verse 9, we have the second woe, and we're now in question number 15. What does he describe about them in verse 9 as the second woe, or the statement of grief coming to them is what? What have they done? Verse 9. Rick.
Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high.
Okay? So he covets evil gain for his house. Covet means greed. He wants gain, but it's not a proper gain, you see. He's not getting it properly. He's taking it from other nations and so on. That he may set his nest on high. What's the idea of setting your nest on high? Again, I think we're symbolic here. Terry.
He's out of the reach of other people. He thinks he's safe.
Okay, it's security, safety. I picture an eagle that builds its nest up high on a mountain or a crag where he thinks he's safe, that others cannot get to him. Well, that's what these people do. They think because they've been able to take what belongs to other people for themselves, for their house, the gain for their house, they think that they're going to be secure. They're going to gather all these things for their own house, and they'll be delivered, last part of verse 9, from the power of disaster. Nobody's going to be able to hurt them because they're safe. They've built themselves safely, and they've got all this wealth now. Now they're rich and they can protect themselves. They don't think anybody's going to be able to harm them now that they've taken what belonged to other people. Okay? So we got the second one is they use evil gain for themselves. All right? Other comments in verse 9? All right, so verse 10 then. How does he describe what they've done? They don't look at it this way, but how does God look at what they've done in verse 10? Terry?
Well, what they're doing is self-destructive. You're devising shame for yourself, and you're going to be cut off.
Okay. And even sinning against your own soul, he says. So even though they thought that they were protecting themselves, they thought they could use all this gain and wealth and so on and build up their cities and protect themselves, that they'd be safe. In fact, their counsel, their plans, their ideas were shameful and were actually hurting their own houses, their own people. The ones they thought they were protecting are the ones who are going to suffer. And they've sinned against their soul by cutting off these other people. Okay? Now verse 11, The stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timbers will answer it. Now this has to be, of course, symbolic. Beams and timbers don't literally cry out. Stones don't cry out. But what's the significance of it? They're building up their houses, protecting themselves. They think they're going to be safe. But the timbers and the stones are going to cry out. Comments, Susie?
They'll testify against them, against their own wickedness.
Okay. I'm reminded of God telling Cain that the blood of his brother cried out from the ground. Abel's blood. Not literally, of course, but that it became, as Susie said, a testimony of the guilt. And then that's the idea they have. Here you're building up your house, and you've got all this wealth, and you're building up these great, strong houses, and you think you're safe, but those very houses testify against you because you didn't get them legitimately or morally. Okay? Other comments through verse 11? Anybody? Well, highly symbolic, but I think it's fairly clear that he's describing the wickedness. He knows the wickedness of these people, the Babylonians, that Habakkuk's been complaining about. God said, I know, and he's going to describe them. There's a woe to them. Yes, they're going to punish the Chaldeans, but they're going to suffer too in the end, okay? Let's do some more reading then, okay? Let's read 12 through 17. We'd like to read chapter 2, verse 12 through 17 for us, please. Chapter 2, Neil, verse 12 through 17, please.
Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that peoples toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk, so as to look on their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup of the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beast by which you terrified them, because of the human bloodshed of violence done to the land, to the town and all its inhabitants.
Okay, so now here's two more woes. We've got the first two: woe to one who increases what does not belong to him, woe to one who uses his evil gain to try to build his own security. Okay, now we have a third woe, verse 12, and what is that? What woe does he pronounce on them in verse 12? And this is question number 18. Woe because they do what? Frank.
Because they build their city on the blood and destruction of other cities. They have destroyed others to build up and build their own power and glory.
Okay.
And it's an iniquity too.
Okay, so again, their violence, that they have achieved this wealth, this gain, by bloodshed and by violence against other cities. Okay? And then in verse 13, how does he describe it? What does he say further about it in verse 13? Again, this maybe gets a little bit more difficult, at least it does for me, verse 13. Susie.
Well, it says, is it not of the Lord? In other words, isn't it of the Lord's doing or by his decree that people who labor and weary themselves in vanity and sin will only come to destruction, and he uses by fire.
Okay, so they labor to feed the fire. And some other translations say it a little bit different than that, but that's what it amounts to. So they're laboring, they're working. Let's see, Frank, what does the English Standard say there in verse 13?
God says, behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing?
Okay, so I think that maybe, at least for me, that was a little bit clear. They're doing all this work, trying for their own gain, trying to protect themselves, and so on. But what's really going to do is just going to, like feeding the fire, and it's all vain. So what happens to the things you use to feed a fire? Yeah, they get burned up. So here these people bring in all this wealth and all this, but it's just to burn it up. It's going to be gone. It's, in other words, just temporary. You're going to lose it. You think you're going to be secure. You're going to have all this wealth and power, but it's just temporary. It'll just all in the end be destroyed. It's all vain. The nations are wearying themselves in vain. Okay, so they're not going to, in the long run, benefit from what they've done. That's what I took it to mean. Other comments through 13? Okay, but verse 14, what will be accomplished? If they're not going to benefit from it, it's just going to like feed a fire. What benefit? Who will, in the end, benefit from it, if you want to call it a benefit? Rick?
Well, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord.
Okay. Like the waters cover the sea. So in the end, what's really going to happen from this is people are going to recognize God. People are going to recognize that it doesn't, well, we would say crime doesn't pay. God's the one who's in the charge here, and even though these people think they're, and it looks like they're winning all these battles and they're gathering all this, and it looks like they're getting ahead, in the end, people are going to acknowledge God. Now, what does that have to do with Habakkuk's question? On question number 21 now. How does this help Habakkuk to hear these things? Answer his question, Velma.
Well, I was thinking that it probably strengthens his faith that God will bring relief and punish these evil nations.
Okay. But that's the bottom line, isn't it? That's the answer to Habakkuk's question. Yes, it looks like the Chaldeans are succeeding. They're wicked. God knows they're wicked. It looks like they're going to accomplish what the Chaldeans want, but in the end they're going to accomplish what God wants. Yes, they're going to punish the people of Judah, and not just Judah. Remember, we talked about all the other nations around them. They're all going to suffer at the hands of the Chaldeans, but in the end, the Chaldeans are going to suffer too. They're not going to get away with it. And the end result of it is going to be the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. How will the knowledge of the Lord come about through this? Susie?
Well, I think about when the children of Israel were traveling from Egypt to Sinai and then on up around. Word spread quickly that the God of this people was powerful. And it's the same thing. God's predicted that this is going to happen, and it happens.
Okay. I think that's the key. The key is that God's saying ahead of time, this is what's going to be. How could it be that these things just happened if, in fact, without any effort on the part of God, or if God, in fact, had predicted it ahead of time? See, to think that the fact that he's telling this to Habakkuk, and we have seen and will see other prophets, that God says these things ahead of time are going to happen to the Babylonians, and then it happens. The glory goes to God, not to these Babylonians who think that they're so great and they're so wonderful and powerful and rich and self-secure and so on. God at the end is going to be, and we're still doing it. Here we're doing it right now as we study these books. The glory goes to God. We're not going to sit here and honor the Chaldeans. They're not going to get the glory out of this. The one who gets the glory out of it is God, because he knew it all along. And he's saying he's behind it all. Terry?
It also brings shame to them, even to this day, for the way they treated other people and acted, and thought they were so above the reach of anyone. Their shame is still revealed, and their punishment is still revealed.
As we read these stories, as we read it in the Bible, we can see that to be the case, that God is honored, but the Babylonians are shamed in the eyes of people for what they did. Okay, other comments? Through verse, let's see, where are we? Verse 14. Terry.
I think it helps us to put in perspective what happens in our lives today. When we feel overwhelmed with something or feel like we just can't get ahead, somebody else who's evil is oppressing, we need to do what Habakkuk did and go up in our tower and sit and watch because God is going to take care of us. He's going to do, and remembering that gives you strength to handle. He may not take the pain away from you, but it gives you the strength to handle it because you know it's not going to continue forever.
So that's the lesson, isn't it? And ultimately, that's what the book is about. It's not just about this specific situation. It illustrates how God works. That God didn't quit working when he got done with the Babylonians. He's still working today. And ultimately, by protecting the people of Judah, he brought Jesus into the world as a descendant of the people of Judah, fulfillment of the promise to Abraham and David and so on. And Jesus then died for your sins and my sins. All of this is a part of a plan. I'm not saying every detail is happening, that God has never necessarily put his finger on every detail, but the overall purpose of God working through history is for the good of those who would serve him. And when we suffer, as Terry was trying to say, as we suffer in this life, as we have problems, and we see the evil around us, and we say, what's God going to do about this? He knows. He's got a plan. He'll take care of it. Trust him. Trust him that he will take care of those things that if you'll do his will, those things that trouble you in this life, the hardships you face. In the end, it's going to work out for you to be the one who's blessed if you serve him. And those who won't serve him are the ones who are going to suffer in the end. Okay, that's the message. Okay? Other comments? Terry.
Also, the idea that no matter who you are, or where you live, or what you think your status is, God is going to punish the wicked because you cannot hide that from him. Even if you've hidden it from everybody else, you can't hide it from him, and he will not overlook those who disregard his law, no matter where they are, Judah or Babylon.
Right, and so again, Habakkuk didn't understand why God would use this wicked nation to punish the Jews, and what's he going to do about the Jews? God knows all about it. You and I think we see wickedness and it's just terrible. We don't know anything compared to what God knows about it. God knows far more about the evils of people around and the things we do, good or bad, than we could possibly know. He's in charge. That's the lesson. Okay? All right. We continues in verse 15 with the next woe. So let's at least begin with it. What's the woe beginning in verse 15? Question number 22. What's the next woe? Verse 22. Verse 15, question 22. Susie.
Well, drunkenness and influencing or encouraging your neighbor to become drunk himself only to take advantage of him.
Okay, so the next woe is getting your neighbor drunk so you can exploit him. You can take advantage of him, but now we'll see, and It seems to me that this is symbolic still. I don't think he's necessarily talking about that the Babylonians went around getting people physically drunk to take advantage of them, although they were known for their drunkenness. Back to the illustration. But this means look on your nakedness. But what's going to happen instead? If you look at the consequence of it, I think we see the symbolic nature of it. Okay, so you're doing this to your neighbor to take advantage of him. What's going to happen instead in verse 16? Susie.
You're the one who will be exposed. Your nakedness, your folly, and sin will be exposed, and God will punish you.
Okay, and God's punishment of them is describing as drinking. That you also drink and be exposed. The cup of the Lord's right hand will be turned against you. Utter shame will be on your glory. So, where they thought they would take advantage of those around, and I believe that other nations, they thought that they would serve a cup of punishment, destruction to the nations around them. Instead, God's going to serve them the cup of punishment and destruction, and they were the ones that would suffer. Okay, and then verse 17 we'll start with next time and look a little bit more closely at that, and then down through the chapter. And then you get into chapter 3, and next time, look at Habakkuk's response. Look at what he's learned, especially at the end of chapter 3. Questions, comments before we close?